Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you to those of you tuning in today on YouTube or Facebook. My name's Matt Falker from the Vocal Jazz Academy, and today we're here to discuss a topic that is certainly springing directly from the dominant national conversation. It's the discussion we're all having and grappling with in one way or another. And of course, this topic hits jazz musicians on another level, both educators and students, since we're involved in continuing a legacy birthed by the creativity and genius of African Americans over the last century plus. So we, and by we I mean Ian Brecky and Christine Guter, who run the Vocal Jazz Academy alongside me and my wife Jessica. It was simply on our hearts to make sure this topic was addressed specifically to folks involved in jazz. So thank you so much for being here. Now, if you know me, you probably know I'm married to a beautiful Black woman that I've spent over 20 years playing keys and organ in Black churches, minister of music. You know, I kind of obsess over the music of Take Six and Ty Tribbett and Anthony Brown and Group Therapy, to name a few. And yet and still, this is not my story to tell. I'm going to get off of the camera and I'm going to do, as they say, I'm going to sit down and listen. So today we have an amazing panel of highly respected Black musicians and educators from around the United States and Canada here for you. So I want to introduce to you our host today. He comes to us from Kansas City, Kansas Community College. His name is John Stafford, and he's a wonderful choral and vocal jazz educator. You've heard his groups at the ACDA conferences and the GEN conferences. A wonderful teacher. Welcome, John. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Well, what's on the docket for today?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for Vocal Jazz Academy for having me host this session. This session is going to be about our own personal stories. How does it apply to the classroom? Because all of us on this panel are educators. And then also, how can we make things better? We hope to get through this within a 60 to 90 minute span. We have quite a few questions that we're going to try to cover within the time period. And so thank you all for being here. Again, thank you to the Vocal Jazz Academy for having all of us have this important discussion. And the discussion is just try to help make things better in the long run. And hopefully this uprising will last for the long run, not just a short-term news cycle. So what I like to do is in terms of introductions, I'm gonna actually have the panel introduce themselves. And of course, my name's John Stafford. I'm the Director of Choral Activities at Kansas Community College. I also teach vocal jazz with Dr. Justin Binnick, who's a good friend and colleague of mine. And I'm going to share my story last. I'm asking the panel to share personal stories they had of racism, because even though all of us are educators, it doesn't matter what level you are in the society, these issues happen, these racial issues still happen. Doesn't matter if you're a garbage man, it doesn't matter if you're a doctor, if you're African-American, or if you're a Black person in general in our society, we have these issues. And we all run into these issues. So I would like to start off with Cynthia in terms of, we're gonna go through all the panel, have them introduce themselves, where they're from, and then they can share their own personal stories. So we're going to start that way. Hello, Cynthia.
Hi, my name is Cynthia Peyson Wahl. I'm an educator in Saskatchewan, which is just north of North Dakota, for those of you who are in the States and don't know exactly where we are, kind of in the center of the country. I was born and raised in Saskatchewan. I'm a classically trained musician who came to jazz later. I went and did a jazz diploma after finishing my Bachelor of Music Education. And I've been teaching in high schools and universities ever since. So I taught for 15 years in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is a province to the east of us and have just returned to Saskatchewan this year to be closer to my family. One of the questions they asked us to talk about in our introduction is a personal experience with racism. And I haven't had any interactions with the police, thank God, yet in my life. And my brother and father were involved in policing in Regina. My brother was a police officer, and my father was a psychologist for the RCMP in Canada. And so I was lucky in that most people saw my name and knew that I was connected to the police. But in the choral world, I've taught vocal jazz and choir throughout my teaching career. In the choral world, and especially in Canada, I don't know, I can't speak to how it is in the United States, but that is a very white space. And so when adjudicating on a panel, I will get, from white colleagues, well, I'll do the Mendelssohn, well, you do the African piece. My history, you have to go back pretty far in the family tree to hit Africa in my experience. If it was Calypso, it would make sense. My parents are from Trinidad, but there's those kind of, and I don't want to call them microaggressions because it doesn't feel micro in the moment. That has been my experience in the choral world, that it is, when you're looking at it through a critical race theory lens, they talk about white property, and the choral world is, and the arts world in general, are viewed as white property. So there's been a lot of justification of my skills, justification of how it is that I have acquired that sounds any good at all if we're doing classical material, and then the kind of explicit or implicit, oh, well, her jazz choirs sound good because she's Black. That's been some of my experiences in the choral world, and navigating that in primarily white spaces. I can count on one hand the number of Black colleagues that I have across Canada, and that's problematic.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Let's go on to the next panelist to introduce. I might like to introduce Lenora, have her tell her about herself and her experiences. So.
Thank you, John. Thank you for having me. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. I am Chicago born and bred, and started my journey as a jazz musician probably at the age of 15, and started teaching about 1994. So I've been teaching about the last 26 years. My experiences with racism are very interesting because they developed as I moved from city to city. Chicago, at the time I grew up in the 60s there, was very segregated. I didn't know it was segregated until I moved to Boston to attend college at Berklee College of Music. And so there were very few instances in Chicago where I experienced it before I was 18. There were some isolated instances of kids calling me. I was always in gifted science programs, and I'd be like the only chocolate drop. And kids calling me names or asking me, why were my eyes hazel? Was I mulatto, et cetera? And I would go home and ask my family, to explain that. But when I got to Boston, it was on and popping. I mean, Boston is, at that time, 1979, when I entered undergrad, was just coming out of a very racially tense period. And so, yeah, we'd be in front of school and folks will drive by and call you the N-word. We were a very small a group of Black kids at Berklee at that time. Maybe it was about 2,500 students, and maybe 1% of us were Black. So it was very present, a very present experience. And probably I've never been, like my colleague Cynthia said, I've never had a particular run-in with the police, but I've had many instances of being discriminated against or biased. I mean, and when I was traveling as a U.S. jazz ambassador for the State Department, one of the times I was by myself and not with those people from the different embassies who accompany you. And my luggage was searched, and I was detained, and I've been detained for, whatever the reason it would be that they would have at the time. And one particular instance in Boston, I was working in a jazz venue. It's a supper club 5 nights a week with my band. I was working with a booking agency. And he told me specifically, flat out, he said, you can only have one other Black person in your band. Wow. And I said, okay. All right. So that being what it is, I was in Boston. It didn't surprise me, but we had been hired 2 more times at that supper club. So 2 times I had like all white players with me. It was just a quartet. The third time they hired me back, I says, well, I was getting a lot of heat from my colleagues, my peers, about why can't you hire us, one of us, to play with you? I mean, what's going on? We need work too. And that was a really weird conversation for me. I mean, I just kind of didn't know what to do at that time. And I didn't have the confidence I had now to like say the kinds of things I feel, that I should say and can say. So I changed out my players, and I had just 1 white player and 2 Black players and myself. And we went on that Monday night to perform. And the next day, the morning, that booking agent called me and he said, so you changed your band, huh? I said, yeah, I changed my band. He said, well, they don't want you back. They're going to pay you for the rest of the month. And, I told you what the rules were at that place. They're very adamant about that. And I was floored. I mean, it took me a minute to get over that. But from that time on, I've always had some kind of experience where race is an issue involved with my music. And that's an important, that's a big pill to swallow and an important thing to get over. I'll stop there. I mean, I've had the entire 26 years I've been teaching, I've had issues of race.
Right. I think we all have. So it's unbelievable. Thank you for sharing your story. So let's move on to Connaitre Miller from Howard University. So welcome, Connaitre.
Hi. Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
I grew up in Kansas, and I've lived in California, lived in Colorado, and now am in Washington, D.C. Been here for 18 years, and I teach at an HBCU, Howard University. I would say that for me, one of the most profound things where race was concerned was when I experienced the lack of it, of racism, and that's when I moved to Australia. When I first went to Australia, which was in 1994, I went there to teach at the Elder Conservatorium, and which is part of the University of Adelaide. I was a full-time jazz voice teacher, and right from when I first got there and started to meet their faculty, they recognized much more so than any of the places that I had studied jazz, that jazz was an African-American art form. And because they recognized this is an African-American art form, you're African-American, you're teaching jazz, you must know your stuff. And so right from the very beginning, I was given an incredible amount of respect. Before they heard me teach a thing, they just assumed that I was going to be great at what I did. And it was intimidating to me at first, unusual. I was not used to having that kind of reaction. And they thought I knew so much more than I really did. And so what I was able to do because of my training, I was able to spend a lot of time in my office after hours learning to do all the things they thought I already knew how to do. I got a chance to really figure out methods of teaching jazz voice and those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. And it really brought to life for me that phrase, the self-fulfilling prophecy, that when people expect a lot from you, you're able to give a lot. And I didn't realize how, in a lot of ways, I'd always felt like I had to really go the extra mile to prove myself. You're like, okay, I have to prove that I'm going to be able to hang with the rest of these people. And in many instances, as Cynthia was talking, I was often the only Black person in my classes, in music, and even at University of Northern Colorado, in many ways involved in the jazz area. I mean, and that just, they had a huge jazz program, but there weren't a lot of Black students, maybe 2 or 3 of us. And so that was, unusual. However, in the reverse, I saw that they had their own prejudices against their Black people. And so the only instances of racism that I dealt with in Australia, I actually had 3. And they were 2 were because they thought I was Aboriginal, and 1 was because they thought I was Maori. So one of the Aboriginal experiences had to do with a rehearsal that I was having on a Sunday afternoon there at the conservatory. And I needed to get into my office to get microphones and cords. And the building had a code, a door, a little lock on the thing that you had to put a code into. And for whatever reason, the code didn't work that day. So I walked over to the security office, like 3 minutes away. And I knew a lot of the guys in the security office because they would come around to check the buildings in the evening, and I was always in my office in the evening working on things. And they got to know, they'd come in, and we would talk and whatever, and and everything was cool. But I happened to see on that day 2 people in the security office who I did not know. One of them was an older white-haired gentleman, and then he had a younger lady with him. She's probably in her late 20s, and they would not help me. I told them I couldn't get into the building, and I told them I knew the code. I showed them my faculty ID. I told them, I said, I have a key. If you'll walk over there with me, we get to my office, you'll see my name on a plaque outside the door. I tried everything I could to prove to them that I really belonged there, that I deserved to be there. I was trying to get this equipment to have this rehearsal. And so within this building where my office was located the Center for Aboriginal Studies in Music, which they called CASM. And they assumed because of that building, he just said, well, you people, that was the first time I heard that phrase, you people would be able to get into the building if you truly had access. And it was one of those things where it's the weekend, you're not supposed to be there. And it was a 3-minute walk over, and they would not help me. And I said, well, can you call the administrator? She'll verify for me. They just wouldn't do it. And so I left frustrated. I did not get my microphones that day. I held the rehearsal without them. And then that Monday morning, I went to the office and I filed a complaint. And so when the complaint went around, the older gentleman, he was getting ready to retire, so he didn't care. He was like, yeah, whatever. But the younger lady, she was really shaken and was actually, quite afraid because this complaint had gone into her file. And she contacted me and tried to talk me out of removing the complaint and saying, well, I didn't mean anything by it. And I had to explain to her why, I asked her, why would you not help me? I gave you so many different ways to verify who I was. And yet, I guess they didn't notice the American accent. They just knew that the building had the Aboriginal music studies in it, and they saw me and assumed that I was Aboriginal, and they just weren't going to help. And so I told her, I said, well, you can use this as a learning experience so that you don't do this to anybody else. It wouldn't make any difference if I was Aboriginal. If I needed to get into the building and I'm showing you that I have, verified proof that I have access to it, you should have helped me. And so that was one of those instances. And so I thought it really brought home to me how racism is taught, because the Australians treated me like I was royalty. Most of the time they would hear that I had an American accent. They wanted to talk to me and ask me questions about what America was like. They loved the music. They just assumed that I was going to do a good job at what I did. But I saw in many cases the way that many of them treated their own Black people. And then also the same thing in New Zealand when I visited there. the way that they would treat the Maoris, who were the New Zealanders, Black people. It's like, this is so strange. They don't have racism against all Black people, just their own, because that's what they were taught. And so I'll leave my story there.
Thank you for sharing that. I have some similarities to your story. So thank you for sharing that. Let's introduce a couple more panel members. Let's introduce the co-founder of Vocal Jazz Academy. She's the main administrator. Let's introduce Jessica Falker. So Jessica and I talked for a while last week. So really enjoyed that conversation. So I'd like to introduce her. I think you're muted, Jessica. There we go.
This is what happens when I let Matt do the admin job. Well, I said it again. I'm just so honored to be amongst all of these amazing panelists. So I'm Jessica Falker. Most of the time I am behind the scenes. Matt and I have been married. It'll be 15 years next month. I hold a K-12 teaching credential in the state of California. So I did my teaching stint at a Title I school, which means that the majority of our students got free or reduced lunch. And that school was very eye-opening because my parents and grandparents are all considered, quote, middle class. So teaching in that school gave me a very different perspective on race and how that formulates. I come from a law enforcement family. So my grandfather and my great-grandfather were special agents in the FBI, some of the first Negro FBI agents. My cousin's a CHP officer, so many friends and family serving in the military and law enforcement. And the fun thing about us is we have 3 kids. And it is no secret to most people who know us, but we have a little Black boy and he has autism. And so the tensions of the last 4 to 6 weeks in regards to police and how they treat our young Black men, but especially young Black men of special needs, compounds the feelings in our household and some of the emotions that have been going through here. As far as incidents of racism or with the police, I have many. None are extreme or violent. I too grew up in Chicago. And so I think the last police incident I had was in February, where I got looked at real hard by some sheriffs doing police activity a block and a half away that had nothing to do with me. But the most profound memory I have as far as racism goes was in school. I had come to Chicago. We had lived in Delaware or Philly before that. So for first grade, I was at a gifted school on the East Coast, and nobody cared that I was the only Black kid because it was nerd school. All of us were these brainy kids who didn't really know anybody. When we got to Chicago, my dad wanted us to go to a parochial school. So we signed up for St. Michael's Catholic Church School in Wheaton, Illinois. And my first year was horrendous. The kids at the school, my sister and I were the only Black kids at the school. My first year of school, you get on the bus. There were kids who definitely did not want me there. I got called the N-word for the first time, several times on the bus. Waiting for the school bus, I got pushed into traffic to see if I would bounce off a car. Had school books thrown in the street, glasses broken on my face. And all of these complaints, of course, were like, oh, kids will be kids. Well, maybe you misunderstood, or maybe you did something. But my favorite was my teacher. She did not want me in her class. She made that abundantly clear. She would do things to intentionally, aggravate or exacerbate a situation. So, things like she would not let me use the restroom. She refused to give me a pass. To the point where my parents were coming down to the school once a week and even got a doctor's note. Uh-oh, did I disappear? I hope I'm still on here. My screen just changed, but
Still there.
still there. Cool.
Mhm.
I got a doctor's note so that the teacher would let me use the restroom in class. Um, things of this nature. She even left me on a field trip. We went to see Ringling Brothers and Barnum Bailey Circus. And I'll never forget it. Took the field trip, took the bus, had a great time. My parents were not able to chaperone. And we were getting ready to get on the bus. And I told the teacher, I said, hold on, I got to use the restroom real quick. And she said, sure, go ahead. You have 2 minutes. And I remember running as fast as I could because I knew she might leave me. And I probably made it there and back in a minute and a half, and the bus was gone. And luckily, my parents always made us keep change in our pockets. So here I am, 7, 8 years old, using a payphone to call my mother from 35 minutes away to come pick me up from school. And she never got fired. If anything was in her file, I don't know about it. About 6 or 7 years ago, as a teacher, you get teacher emails and things about that. And come to find out that she won a Crystal Apple Award for excellence in education after all of that. So, yeah, I used to not like school very much. And so maybe that's why I went into the classroom, is to try to make a difference.
Right. Right. Thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
And, yeah. Thank you. And then last but not least, let's introduce Duane Davis, who we really appreciate having here. And we'd love to hear his story as well. Thank you, Duane.
Thanks, John. It's such a pleasure to be on this committee. I have this whatever this is, this panel. I have such respect for the other panelists. I've sat and observed their work. I've been on adjudicating teams with them, and I just hold them in high regard. I think one of the questions that was asked was, why do we want to join this discussion? And I have a couple of reasons. One is that we never get to talk about this with our colleagues. And another is that it is a necessary topic. I mean, you could see the robustness now that is covering not just a small nucleus of people, but the whole world. We are 401 years from when the first African was brought to Jamestown and was enslaved. So, that is the big pandemic we've been dealing with, COVID-19. But the looming, the one that's over all of it from 401 years ago, is another pandemic, and that is racism. And I'm from the North. I'm from Cleveland, where racism was disguised. My wife is from the South. She's from Virginia, where racism is overt. There's no question about how people feel. It was spoken, it was shown in signs. But in the North, people would make you think that you were okay, but behind your back, they were doing other things. They were, not opening doors and talking about you and things of that nature. I don't have a particular incident about police. I'm always a little nervous when the signs come on, the lights come on. But there's nothing that really stands out except one incident in Southern Ohio. My wife and I and the children were driving down to Virginia. And Southern Ohio, I'm driving towards West Virginia Turnpike, and the police pulled me over. And I didn't quite understand why, because there were cars that were passing me. But this one time I passed a car because they were going slower than the speed rate. The policeman said I was speeding. Now, you have to know my wife. Some of you know her. She does not hold her words. You almost have to tape her mouth shut when she gets, when she has something to say. She said, my husband wasn't speeding. I said, you're putting your hand over. Just Don't say anything. And he took us some back road someplace. Now that I think about it, I mean, that was pretty scary because I'm in a very remote part of Ohio, and he took us back to some place where a magistrate was, where I had to pay money, and let us go. I think as a black man, I am always a little anxious. You know, we went into a store. I won't even name the store, but it's a national store. And my wife is standing in line, and she pays for our product with a check, and the cashier wrote BLK on the back of it. And my wife has antenna like this. I mean, she catches everything. She said, "Why did you write that?" She said, "What? Why did you write BLK on there?" She said, "Well, no, it doesn't mean anything." She said, "I've been in this line, and there are 3 white women that have come before me, and you wrote nothing. You didn't ask for any ID or anything. Now you want to know who's my mama, who's her cousin, and everything. And plus you write BLK." So my wife doesn't back down, and she's getting louder, and the manager comes up, and my wife explains what the problem was, and of course the cashier was at fault, and my wife left the product there, took the check, and walked out, and never to this day, and this is when our kids were very little, and they're in their 40s now, never has she been back to that store. Another incident, I was teaching high school, and one of the colleges asked me to come and direct a choir. Well, when I got there, they said, "We want you to direct the gospel choir." "Why are you asking me to direct the gospel choir? Have you ever seen me do a gospel choir?" At the time, I was directing at a Presbyterian church. "Why do you think I'm qualified to direct a gospel choir? You've never heard me play it, sing it, conduct it." And of course, I turned that down. I could have done something, but I didn't like the fact that they just assumed because I was black that I would just be able to do the gospel choir. My most recent job was teaching at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. That was a great 3 years. But to drive from Grand Rapids to Bloomington, I would drive, through Indiana, get to Indianapolis, and then there's about an hour or so before you get to Bloomington. Between Indianapolis and Bloomington is the largest, historically, KKK community. Historically, that's what it was. And I don't know if it still holds that record. I mean, in Indiana, not in the country, but in Indiana. And I tell you, every time I drove from Bloomington home, I made sure it was in the day, and I made sure I had gas. And I'm sure people that are in those communities between Bloomington and Indianapolis would not be so proud of that. Those who, I don't know if they still hold that record, but it makes you nervous inside as a black man to go through a community like that. I don't want to stop. I don't want to go to the bathroom. I don't want to go to the restaurant. I don't want to do anything. And we have something similar in Michigan. As I drive to Detroit, there's a place that had a very large community. I'm almost done, by the way. There are things that annoy me as a black man, as a human being. I don't like to sit in the back of a restaurant, especially when the restaurant's not full. So don't take me back to the restaurant and I'm looking at all of these empty tables. I don't like anyone to rub my head. There are a lot of things I don't like. I have more, but I'll stop right there.
Thank you, Duane. I have a lot
You're
of things I don't like either, so I really get that. I really do. My own personal story, I've gone through some of the same things as my colleagues here. I'll try not to be too long. In terms of my background, my short background, my background is pretty traditional in terms of music. I'm from Central Illinois. I'm from Champaign-Urbana area. So my mother and my uncle worked for the University of Illinois, so I grew up in that area. And so in terms of my undergrad, I went to Milligan University, and that's how I got into vocal jazz. I didn't get into it until college, so I did vocal jazz with Steve Wiedenhofer, starting my freshman year of college. And then, but I mostly studied choral music and music business. So, and I went to graduate school at Bowling Green State, Ohio for my master's, and I did doctoral work at University of Illinois. And, but throughout that whole time, I studied mostly not only music business, but I studied composition and conducting. And I have several stories I could share. One story that I have that really changed me for the better, but it was still a harrowing experience, was it was when I was at Bowling Green. It was my first year getting my master's degree. And I was in the choir, then I was in the graduate choir. There was undergrads and grads in the choir, of course. I remember the choir being exactly 40 people. I was the only Black person in the choir. There was one Latino gentleman in the choir, and everybody else was white. The conductor was a good gentleman, and him and I are still good colleagues to this day. He's a great guy. And we did a trip, it was around 2001, and we did a summer tour, and we went to Germany, Austria, and Czech Republic. And I'll never forget any of these details. We actually went from Munich, we performed in Munich, then Salzburg, then Vienna, and Prague. That was the tour schedule. And so it was just a conductor who was white and the 40 students, which a third of the students were grad students. And so Vienna and Prague were the last two cities on the trip. So traveling in between Vienna and Prague, we stopped at a truck stop for lunch. And so we were in the Czech Republic at that moment outside of Prague. And so at this truck stop, the way it was organized, it was a truck stop that had, it was like the gift shop area, the gas station gift shop area, convenience store, and then the restaurant area attached. There was a restroom lobby in the middle. And so there was a long line. We waited in a long line of people. It was around lunchtime. And I was at the end of the line, not because of a racist issue. I was just the people I was hanging out with and talking with. I was just near the end with a bunch of people. And so me, the Latino person, and a few of the white students, we were just talking. And so coming out of the restroom, out the door, was actually two skinheads. And so I'm 6'3" and 200 some odd pounds. So I'm a bigger gentleman. But these two other gentlemen were bigger and taller than I am, at least 6'6". Both look like they are pro wrestlers, you know? So, and anyway, but they were probably maybe 15 feet from me. And so, and I'm the only one that looks like me. I mean, I'm in Czech Republic, so I'm probably the only one that looks like me within a 1,000-mile radius. And so as they walked past, they said probably every racial thing in the book directed towards me to try to instigate something with me. And I did nothing but stare them down and kept my mouth shut. And they just walked out laughing. They're trying to instigate me. And I learned from there, if I did anything, then I probably wouldn't be here today. And so I thought through in that situation every scenario I could do. And yeah, it's just, and the best thing to do was just kind of hold your ground and not do anything. And so it's kind of it was a scary experience, but at the same time, I learned some things from that and how to handle, how to think on your feet and how to handle situations. Because my father's from the South, from Memphis, so he taught me from a very young age how to handle some situations like that. My father grew up in Memphis, and he was really into the civil rights movement in the 60s, of course. So my father has always been, my mother and father has always, from a young age, told me how to act in certain situations. So that training was actually helpful in this situation in Europe. And actually, this is a story that I just shared with people maybe recently. This happened in 2001, and now it's 2020. I probably just started sharing this story maybe 2 years ago. So it's a really big learning experience for myself. So anyway, I want to thank our panel for sharing their experiences with them. And what I like to do, we're pretty far into this already, but I do have some questions lined up, and I'm just going to jump into a question for all the panel to answer. The George Floyd lynching, I don't call it killing, I call it lynching. The George Floyd lynching, if it happened during the school year, how would you, if this uprising happened during the school year, how would you address it with your students, whether your class was a performance-based class or if it was more academic-based? How would you address this situation? And to answer, so we make sure we take in turns not talking over one another, if you could just put your hand up saying, I have something to say, that'd be great. So whoever would like to start. Cynthia?
So for me, music and social justice are inextricably linked. And I don't know if that is just because in Trinidad, the history of calypso music has always been about the state of that country of Trinidad, but we would have already been talking about this. We were already talking about this. We were singing "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody" in my senior concert choir this year, and using the call and response text to deal with issues that were real for those kids. So social justice and the state of the world that the kids are actually living in is inextricably linked from what I'm teaching anyway. So this would just be another layer that we would add on. I don't know if everyone includes that in their programming, but so much of my programming comes from the real concerns that are happening for the kids. And I had a fairly non-diverse, I was at a private school this year, a fairly non-diverse choir. And I taught for 15 years in the inner city in Winnipeg, where I had, like, you could pick out the one or two white kids in a choir of 120 for most of my time. So it was a real switch for me to understand what their issues were. But I was lucky that I was in a school where they were trying to look outside of themselves. And so there were kids who were dealing with and wanting to be an ally, wanting to be a co-conspirator on racial issues. We had a lot of kids who were working with the LGBTQIA community and wanting to contribute to that. So I feel like because we already had a mission to think about social justice in whatever area the kids were interested in and whatever subjects were meaningful to them in their lives, this would have just dovetailed very nicely with what we were already doing. And I feel like that it's a way of making the course more meaningful to a life application for these kids, but also a way of making the music more meaningful for them in the making, and therefore more meaningful for our audiences. If it's just about pretty voices and notes, like, I don't know why we would waste all of our time on that. It's just it's not enough.
Right. Lenora?
I teach at an HBCU here in North Carolina, Central University in Durham, North Carolina. And we are always talking about race in one form or another. When acts like Sandra Bland or Trayvon Martin, George Floyd happen, the students are always, as soon as they sit down, they immediately start talking about that. And so it's not something you can choose not to talk about. I teach jazz, and jazz is African American music. So we're always talking about race when we talk about the music. So one of the most important things I think is that I have an obligation to do is leading them to an understanding of how to manage their emotion around what they see and feel.
Right.
Because you need access to those emotions to create. And you cannot be a creative, cannot be a musician and have any of that at half-mast. You always have to expect, aside from the music is one conversation and one issue, but how they feel as people when their humanity has been stricken from them. The George Floyd situation, we're not in school right now, but my students still called me. They still text me about it and how they feel about it. And it's the proverbial knee in the neck. That's gone beyond even what we saw, that lynching that we saw. So as educators, we have to prepare ourselves for the conversation that parents don't want to have with their young people about this is what will happen when you leave our door, our nest. But when you're on a campus and you're kind of like a sitting duck almost. We recently had to go through a kind of safety drill on campus because here's an HBCU, sitting for if someone decided that they were going to, do a ride through our campus. Here we are. So there are many layers of the conversation of race that we have to deal with our students, aside from the music. Even in the music, there are long conversations about when they hear, and we have a jazz studies master's degree, which attracts a lot of non-people of color. We have a lot of whites in our program. And on campus, it's one of the most integrated programs on campus. You have conversations amongst the students about race and jazz and whose jazz is it. So as an educator, you're plucked in the middle of it.
Let's see. Let's do Duane, then Connaitre. So,
I went to a historically black college for undergrad. First time I had been South, I went to Knoxville College. And that was an education that I just I value because it taught me to appreciate education, first of all. The black students from the South, really, education meant something. Us Northerners, we had swag and, all of that. And you look at these students that were serious and I think, man, I need to get my stuff together. So when you get to George Floyd, because there was a cab driver that was killed on our campus during a riot. My wife and I went to Kent State the year after the 4 students were murdered by the National Guard. I think when you have something like a George Floyd, you have to tell the truth, first of all, because we're the buzzword in elementary, middle, and high school. No bullying, don't tease, don't. But this is the ultimate, right? This is the ultimate bullying that leads to death. And when you look that since 2015, there have been 1,293 black people that have been murdered by policemen, which is twice what you find proportionately in the white race. So I think that, you have the George Floyd was the straw that broke the camel's back.
right.
It's been simmering, it's been boiling, and it would percolate a little bit, but when you see the explosion that death created, and some people will try to discount it and go, well, do you know what he did and well, who of us can point the finger? Because we all got stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that this man was killed, that was just like, you can't take anymore. Enough's enough.
Right.
So I think it's important to tell the truth and to have honest discussion with students about those feelings. Otherwise, they're pent up and they're not going to be released properly.
Right. Right. Thank you. Connaitre, you were going to say something?
I would use an opportunity like that to have my students actually create music. We have a sort of a mini documentary out right now called Afro Blue, A Year in the Life. You can find it on YouTube. And there's a segment in there where I talk about in 2016, we found out like after the election, when we were all kind of shell-shocked that we had some of our students that had not voted. And so at first I was pissed off, but then, as an educator, I realized, okay, why are they not doing this? Some people have just gotten a little too comfortable. So I have a master class where I teach all the jazz voice students once a week, and I gave them an assignment. I said, okay, your assignment is you are going to write a song about something going on in the world today that speaks to you, something that you would like to improve, whatever it is. And I told them, if you're not comfortable writing a song yet, because they're at different levels in their musicianship, write a poem or some sort of spoken word piece. And the product that we got, I mean, it's brilliant. These students are so creative, but it also got them to really start to pay more attention to what was going on around them. Now, I had some students who really get emotional about the things that are going on, and it's a type of music therapy. It's like, okay, let it out. Write a song, write a poem, something that expresses how you feel. And then we would do a program where they perform those pieces for each other, and they're able to really use their music to have a voice. And then we did a program, my colleague Jessica Boykin-Settles and I, we did a program actually outlining the history of music in the civil rights era to show how artists can use their art to have a voice. And it was, it had a lot of historical content and multimedia issues. And so the students were learning all about what had happened before, as well as using their own creativity to have a voice now. And I've used that assignment since then as well. To this past January, we were celebrating the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. And so in the fall semester, I gave them an assignment to write a song that was inspired by his legacy, that we had a performance to do at the Smithsonian African American Museum. And they're so creative. And so if this had happened while we were in school, we would have, first of all, had many discussions about it. We just opened up the classroom. Mm-hmm. It's like, there's nothing that I'm going to teach you today that's more important than what you need to talk about. Because that's what happened after the election. We spent, I think, 3 days with just letting them talk to each other and discuss. And then we find a way to use it to create.
Yeah, that's, I could take something from all four of you. That's amazing stuff. From my end, I'm not going to talk too long because I want to keep it moving. But from my end, and I think all of you will probably agree with me, our position as educators, I feel like our position as educators is to serve. Not only music that we create serves our community. And so sometimes that service, it's about just depending on what the text would be based on a particular time, whether it's this particular issue or whether are we talking about gay rights or as a choral musician, more religious issues. So I just think this idea of service towards our community and towards our students is a really important factor. I kind of go along similar terms of Cynthia's comment in terms of it's always ingrained in the curriculum. I think a little bit along those lines because I'm always thinking about how can I serve these students and these communities. So thank you for sharing all those things. Moving along, in addition to moving along, what would you say to not only your white colleagues about how to make things better or how they can improve in terms of how they can improve race relations, but what would you also say to your Black colleagues on what they can do better as well? So it's a two-part question. So whoever would like to go first about that, and this question is for all of you. Right, Connaitre, let's go with Connaitre, then Duane.
I would say that, as I mentioned when I was first introducing myself and talking about my experiences in Australia, one of the most important things for me was that when I first got there, them recognizing and understanding that jazz is an African-American art form. Now, we say we know that, but there are so many places in this country that don't teach jazz history really from that perspective.
Right.
Really understanding where this music came from. So I think it's important that if you're going to teach jazz, to not just enjoy the wonderful music and the way it sounds, but to do a little bit of research and understand where the music came from and how out of something in our country, a really ugly history, something so beautiful came out of this. And you really don't want to separate the two. I think it adds depth to it would add depth to the music, rather than just scratching the surface. And I think we would all agree that it's too bad in a lot of the the majority of the music education programs in this country that jazz history isn't a requirement, or that jazz isn't a requirement. And we spend so much time teaching Western European music and the history of it in detail, back to the Renaissance and the Baroque and all that. You have choral directors who would not try to perform Bach's music without understanding something about the history of the music and how it evolved. But yet we try to do that where jazz is concerned. But just because it's not part of the curriculum and you weren't required to learn it doesn't mean that you can't do that work on your own. I mean, with the internet, the resources are so plentiful. So I think that sometimes, as an adjudicator, when I'm listening to groups, I hear a lack of understanding of the depth of the music, whether it be how the rhythm is treated, or how the bended notes or the blue notes have, their place in the music, and that sometimes the trend is to skip over the traditions of the history of jazz and go straight for the contemporary, more sort of orchestral, straight eighth note feel, that because it's a little easier than having to try to dig into that swing eighth note and some of those other things and I'm not saying that you have to do only that, but I think it deserves the respect of digging into the history of the music and understanding where it comes from. And I would say to my African American colleagues, this is some of the same thing, understanding where the music comes from, and to let the anger and the emotions that we feel fuel us to move further and create, but don't let it consume you, because we can't. I just read a lot of things on Facebook from different people that I know, and sometimes it's a little hurtful to think the anger can maybe debilitate people, to keep them from being able to actually function in a creative way. So let's try to keep love at the basis of what we're doing, but let that anger that you feel fuel your creativity and moving forward.
Great. So you mean I shouldn't be so aggressive right now in my thoughts?
You can be as aggressive as you want to be, but to the point, don't let it absorb you.
Okay.
Don't let it consume you.
Man, you said some great things, and I think when people realize that the history of jazz is American history, they go hand in hand. That for people not to include jazz in their curriculum is a mistake. And there are many classical colleagues that I have that just will not touch it for fear that they don't know it. And neither did I. I was classically trained. But if this is an American product, and we talk about Buy American and all of this stuff, this is an American art form that should be included. That's one thing. The other thing is make sure that music that you're choosing is studied. I mean, that the history of this music. How many times have I sat at a festival and heard someone sing Summertime? Now, many of you know that I was chorus master for the opera for 31 years. And so I love that art form. And anytime that I've done Porgy and Bess, of course, that's the first aria that's sung. But it's one thing to hear a black cast sing this music. But when I hear a white person sing with Daddy and Mammy standing by, I put my pen down I get out my microphone and I just do a little lecture because that word is offensive to Black folks, especially to me, because of its connotations. And there's a way to sing that song, perhaps, that would soften that. And so I would say do the research on the music that you're choosing. You know, do you know the original lyrics to Old Man River, the
Right.
original verse, you know, that type of thing. Because sometimes just your performance of that, however good you are, could offend someone in the audience because it brings up some thoughts. I think that's good.
Go ahead, Cynthia. Then Lenora. You're muted, Cynthia.
I have to do that
There you
myself.
go.
I got it. Okay. One of the comments that I was seeing in the Facebook comments, or the live comments that are happening, is someone was asking as white allies what they can do, and I think that a lot of the actions that I would say to a white ally, I would also say to my black colleagues: look at your school, look at your program, and then look at your ensembles. And if it doesn't match, you got to do something. If you have 40% Black kids in your program and 2 Black kids in your choir of 100 kids, you got to do something. Something has to change. Something is not working about how you're reaching out. I think that it was very interesting that I first met Lenora at Gen in 2019. And the entire reason she came up, and probably 4 or 5 other people that I made friends with at that session, is because they don't see Black people on vocal jazz panels. They don't see it. And I was the only Black person on that panel. And I loved it, and it was great. And I had wonderful colleagues, and I loved everyone I was working with. But it is not, it was so uncommon to see a Black vocal jazz educator presenting at a conference like this, in that kind of session, that people had to come say hello to me. Other Black people had to come say hello to me. So we need to be encouraging, our young Black skilled musicians in our programs to get out there and be Black educators in schools. I went to a very large grad school here in Canada, and I could count on 2 hands and 1 finger how many Black students were in that program of over 1,000, in that school of over 1,000. We need to be in the classroom doing this work, and we need to be encouraging our young people to look at this as a viable option, so that other young Black musicians can see themselves reflected in their educators.
Yes, good. Lenora?
I'll definitely piggyback on Cynthia in that regard, on that point, because when my students go to Gen or go to these conferences and they look around and don't see themselves,
Yes.
they ask me, where are we at?
Yes.
And I have to sit down with them and have a conversation about the many layers that could be. We performed at a conference, and after it was like an adjudication, and afterwards we got really nice comments from the adjudicators, and they said, "Where have you been? We haven't heard of you." And I said, "We apply every single year."
Mm-hmm.
And they looked at each other. I said, "We apply every year, so we've been trying." And so there is something that needs to be addressed about the decisions that are made and how that happens. If you are in a leadership, I'll say to my white and Black colleagues, if you are in a leadership position to make decisions about anything where students, especially when students are present, because if students don't see themselves, they're taking a hike. They're going to pick another road or career.
Right.
And we are responsible for that, all of us, for making the decisions to be for it or against that lack of representation. Whether we feel like we'll be ostracized for it, or whatever is the term, or whatever is the way. So you have to have the courage to speak up, and or raise your hand to be part of that process. That also happens for my white and Black colleagues. I'll say this: when you are in a position at the table of a selection committee for a job in a jazz program, and if the faculty is not represented, is not diverse, ask yourself why. If you are teaching African American music in a music program in this country, where American music is supposedly the treasure of America, and your faculty has no Black people, ask yourself why. What are the processes that you are using? It's not that we're not available. It's not that we don't have the resumes and the tick marks. You know, those are decisions that can be changed, and those are processes that can be changed. When you have faculty, I'll say to my Black and white faculty, when you have faculty of color who are going in the promotion tenure process, sometimes the Black faculty, the one Black faculty, or the one woman Black faculty is used as the go-to person to mentor the social, emotional, etc. Mindset, stability, whatever, of, like, they'll send me all the Black women to talk to, you know, and we may spend a lot of time talking and helping those students acclimate, process, have be supported. But there's no place in the, if you spend a lot of time doing that, there's no place in the reappointment, promotion, tenure, the RPT process, where you get credit for that. Well, that's a kind of grounded theory. You know, that's a kind of way to help the students and the faculty learn what it is to be in stress from race, from issues around race, in your work environment and in your educational environment. So there are many different threads of it, and we all can do things to change the way it looks now, because if we don't, we'll have this conversation 20 years from now.
Exactly.
We'll have this conversation for a long time. The other, I mean, I could go on, but one last recommendation is there's a book that I found, Presumed Incompetent. It's about race and class, women of race and class in academia, presumed incompetent. It's really powerful, because there are things that you're blind to that we all do, that continue to bring race as an issue for women in academia and for our women students. Mm-hmm. So it's really many, many layers, but we all can do something about it.
That's true. That's a great lead in to the last main question that I have. I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's okay. I just coming from a secondary school position, and I agree with what Miss Lenora said, and I can't speak to a lot of things, but if you are on those hiring committees and you are white, it is upon you to say, hey, we can't hire another white male again in our staff. You know, you have to speak up and say, can we look at putting some diversity here? I know that those conversations happen in this house. And that's all I can really say. But it is incumbent upon you to speak up as well. So one of the reasons this first question is Black colleagues, as Black educators, and it's just as Black people, if you walk in white circles, I know I asked, that everybody share a story. A lot of times we don't want to talk about the stuff because we get tired of living in it. We get tired of sitting in it all the time. If we experience microaggressions on a daily basis or a weekly basis or whatever, and it's important because we're all so happy to be together with the colleagues, or I know at Gen Conference, I'm just happy to see everybody. But to share your experiences is extremely powerful. And I say that because all three of our kids look different. and I have one child that looks like my husband. And so my conversations with her are just like we're having now. It's like, you need to be an activist. You need to be proactive, because people are going to say and do things in front of you, not knowing that your mama looks like this. So if you are the white person in those situations, you know, you have the obligation to educate yourself first and foremost. And I know that seems like a lot right now with everything going on, but you have to educate yourself. You have to take a look at, if you're in the secondary schools, how your history is being taught, because a lot of this was erased out of the history books. And so you have to examine, those of you that went to HBCUs have learned about our history. I learned more when my daughter went to an all-Black charter school in the first 3 years she was there than I ever did in the 12 years I went to regular schools. So it's incumbent upon that. And we shouldn't have to do the work. We shouldn't have to reach out. We shouldn't have to explain and make ourselves available all the time. But in order to progress things faster, like I was just saying before, I'm volunteering at my kids' school. I called it out. They were developing their response plan, and they wanted to produce resources for, what do they call it? Tolerance and equity.
Right.
And so I reached out and said, hey, I'm a Black parent at our school. Our school's a hybrid homeschool, so most of the kids are white. Hey, I'm a Black parent at the school. My kids are Black. I would love to answer questions or give feedback or anything. And they were like, well, we're developing our plan as an organization, and we'll get back to you. And the email, I was like, I don't know why I didn't like the response. And the next day I emailed back and I said, well, how many people of color are on this committee? Who's formulating the plan?
Mm-hmm.
Who's coming up with the response? Because if nobody looks like me, or the Latino brothers and sisters around here, or a huge Native American population, if none of us are on the committee, then your response is useless and it's going to fall flat. You are not going to produce the appropriate resources for these parents that are asking for resources so they can start having conversations with their kids. So you need to look at your committee. And once again, I volunteer as tribute. Let's not have 12 white people in a room deciding what the tolerance and equity resources are going to be. No.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's great point. There's a few questions here. We are getting short on time. Nadine Smith asked, I wanted to ask the panel, from programs that reading music is the focus, hence you can't have a continuation of vocal jazz or instrumental music if the students can't perform. Do any of you want to elaborate on that? Connaitre?
I teach at university level, and when we run our vocal jazz ensemble auditions, I have one day where I teach the music, and then the second day they come back and they audition individually with other members of the ensemble. For me, the focus is, can you retain your part once it's taught to you? I mean, can you learn it? Even if we have a lot of students who maybe don't necessarily read music all that well, but they have great ears.
Right.
They can adapt to the style. They have great voices.
Yep.
I mean, we are talking about music that started off as an oral art. Why
Right.
should reading music be the primary focus for this style of music when that's not the history of it?
Right.
It goes back to not understanding the roots of what the music is and where it comes from.
Yes.
And so that you would keep students from being part of the ensemble because they don't read well. You know, the only person that is the person that's being mostly affected by that negatively is the director and the people that have to listen to them.
That's
I mean,
right.
you know, so I say find different ways to hold your auditions, and then you can teach them. If reading music is really important to you, we can find all kinds of exercises to learn to read music better. In our program, all the students who are involved in my top ensemble are all music majors, so they're learning music and other how to read music in other courses and having it reinforced. But we find ways to reinforce the music reading as well. It's just not the most important aspect.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I totally agree. Not only is jazz a style that was originally taught through listening, but also there are 1,000 genres of music and styles of music and cultures of music for which reading is very unimportant, and why are we stuck on notation as the only as a gatekeeper for who's allowed into music or not? Even with, in my fairly affluent school this year, where I've got tons of kids who take private lessons and are accomplished music readers. I've got 4 or 5 kids who decided to join choir for a lark in grade 12 who've got great ears and don't know what a whole note is. I'm not going to stop them from being involved in programming where they could really excel, because they don't have a sort of, that's my job. I'm the teacher. I need to get them there. If the reading is that important, if they can't accomplish anything without the reading, that's why I get paid. That's the gig. You got to take them all. You got to take them where they're at and then get them to where they need to be.
Duane.
I think one of the fears that a lot of learned people have is that fear of improvisation. But as Black people, we've been improvising our whole journey. And I think that's why it became part of the art form. And now you find that a lot of universities are trying to encourage even the classical students to take something that will allow them to be freer on the piano or with their flute or violin. That improvisatory art just allows a freedom that needs to be included in all art forms, I think.
Right. That is so true. This is great answers. Lenora?
I think that I love what Connaitre shared about having to have ears and respecting that as a tool and as a skill set, because you really need to focus in on how to listen and how to hear in jazz. Like, that's the thing. That's what we're leading them to. Mm-hmm. And if we focus on if they could read or not, or even this practice of requiring them to and judging them negatively if they don't sing an aria in their audition. If you're entering as a master's degree student, I'm interested in your specialization or your ability to move to a specialized area in jazz. So we have a very Eurocentric based, in this country, our music programs are Eurocentrically based. And for our music education majors to come out of, to graduate and to go through their probably entire matriculation from undergrad to grad to doctoral program, and not take jazz as a requirement. This has to change. This really has to change, because then when I get conversations or phone calls or emails from alums who graduated in music education, my school, my K through 12 job, they want me to do a jazz song and I don't know how to do it. Can we meet for lunch and you give me some pointers? And I was like, no, it's not a condiment like ketchup. You don't like learn it over coffee.
Right.
No, you have to respect the art form. Would you be able to teach me how to sing in Italian over coffee? Mm-hmm. And so there's a lack of respect for what the music is, the history of it, and what we do, that we cultivate and continue to propagate in the music education programs. And we have to change that.
Oh, it's not coffee, it's the beans, it's not the condiments, right?
It's not a condiment, I love that.
Right. Yeah, that's amazing. Lastly, we don't have too much time because some of our panelists do have to leave by 30 after. But the last question, just briefly, can all of you elaborate on what do you think the next steps we need to take, not only with our students but also within our community and just in general? What are their next steps? What should happen next for us to progress? Duane?
I think our ensembles learn to be a family, for one thing. And quite often they demonstrate to those outside what it means to share, to have patience, to give and take. And so we need to continue to do that. But I think we also need to not be fearful of continuing to learn ourselves. Sometimes we stand in front of our students and we think we have to have it all together.
Right.
And it was so freeing to me when I could stand in front of my students and say, I don't know how to improvise, but we can learn together. I don't know this, but we can learn together. And I'm not diminished as an educator by that. I'm still the conduit through which this learning is going to take place, in a sense. But if they know that that we can learn together, I think it's something comforting to me as an educator.
Right.
So we need to continue to do that.
Right.
And listening to this art form, because it annoys me. I seem to be the most volatile on this committee, but it bothers me when I look at ensembles and it is so sterile and so just so, and there's no life behind that. There's no light in the eyes. There's no, you could see a combo playing and this horn player's playing and he's there and the pianist is there and they won't look at each other and like, ooh, yeah, I know. There's no language going on. And this comes from this back and forth, this conversation, this music makes you want to, makes me want to stop my mic right now. Okay.
Right. But it goes along with what you said about telling the truth, though. So just being honest. So anybody else who wants to go next? What can we do better? Connaitre and then Lenora?
I think that the fact that people are asking the questions now and they're open to learning and to exploring things is really great. I remember reading on Facebook a couple of days ago. I'm not sure right now who it is, but there's a start of a website to introduce people to more African American arrangers and composers of jazz music, because the question had been going around about where the resources are. People are recognizing, they're starting to be more aware of inequities, realizing that this music, which is an African American art form, that the majority of the arrangers that they're doing their music from are all white. And so like, well, where are the Black arrangers? And so that was a separate conversation. I know I have a lot of material that I'm actually tweaking now. But finding a way to get into that. I know a lot of people are self-producing their own music, and so that may be the way to go. But I think just also just being willing to be honest with yourself, to ask yourself, are there things that I'm doing where my students are concerned, particularly my Black students, where I am assuming that they're not going to be as good at this, or they're not going to be as good at that, or am I assuming they're going to be better at this simply because they're Black? They're going to be, as in Duane's experience, they're going to be the ones that automatically know how to do gospel music, or they're going to be the ones that are going to be the best ones to sing this particular song. I went through that myself at the University of Northern Colorado, getting stuck with the solos for style of music that that wasn't my forte. Give me the jazz thing and I'd throw it down, but don't expect me to sing the gospel tune. That wasn't my job. I mean, I've learned how to do it now from my students at Howard. They've taught me that, but that isn't something that I could teach them. I just got to turn them loose and let them do their thing. And then just, add my level to it. So I think just asking yourself, being honest, am I doing those sorts of things? Am I holding some of my African American students back, assuming they're not going to be able to do this as well? Or am I stereotyping them with this type of music, and then being willing to make those changes?
Right. Great. Anybody else?
I love that. Connaitre, I'm waiting on your vocal jazz arranging book. Please write one. You just are awesome.
I've got tons of it.
Yeah, you're a gift to our field for sure. Yeah, I remember that conversation in Vocal Jazz Educators about where are the Black composers, and I was lit up like I was hot. I was fit to be tied with that conversation, because you don't see us doesn't mean we don't exist. But what I would like to see going forward is really thinking about the next generation, where the Black vocal teachers don't only have to teach voice, they can teach music theory and arranging and composition. So if you don't put us in those roles, then the singers don't think that there are other roles that they can pursue in terms of their careers in academia. We start to truncate and put people in boxes, put the students in boxes when they don't see that on the faculty. You can have how many Black vocalists who teach music theory or arranging at on their campus? How many are the director of jazz studies? How many are director of choral activities, right? So there's a ghettoization, is that a word? You ghettoize us in ways that you don't really realize. And it's not so subtle anymore because we're gonna age out in a little while. And so I would love for my students to be encouraged when they go to the conferences or when they look in the College Music Society book and look up all the music programs across the country for their jazz pedagogy exercise, that they see the faculty where some of the women are in these roles. You need women in leadership, you need Black people of color, Native American, Latina, you need them in places of leadership and making the decisions as well. If we don't, we're going to keep this perpetuated. It's so important. And it just takes a shift and some courage to make it happen.
Age out. That got to me. Thank you, Lenora.
Okay, so we'll have to wrap it up. But I just want to thank you all for being here. Thank you very much. And so thank you all for being here. I hope we haven't discussed this just yet. It's just early in the process, but I hope we can continue to have more of these conversations through the Vocal Jazz Academy. Fingers crossed. And then I just wanted to thank the board of directors for the Vocal Jazz Academy, Matt, Jessica, Ian, and Christine, for allowing us to have this conversation. And hopefully we can continue to have this conversation in the future. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for your wonderful insight. And I'm gonna hand it over back to Matt. So, and thank you all that are on Facebook and YouTube for observing. And I hope this was helpful for everybody so we can all move forward together. Thank you again.
Thank you, John, for being such a great host today. Thank you, Duane Davis, Connaitre Miller, Cynthia, Peyson, Wahl, Lenora, Helm, Hammonds, and of course, Jessica Falker for being a part of this. Absolutely amazing. And I want you all to know that the panelists could see the comments that you all are leaving on YouTube and Facebook, even if we didn't address them all today. But the encouragement and the love that was felt is just much appreciated. We are going to keep these conversations going. I know a few people were commenting and saying, okay, so is this group coming back for more? Are they going to talk some more? We're certainly going to discuss that. We certainly want to open up the discussion to have active discussion with white educators and the other educators that are doing vocal jazz in this time. So all of this, we want to hear from you all, and please give us some feedback so we can just keep this conversation going. Thank you all from the bottom of our hearts. You can find this session, the recording, the playback will be available on YouTube, and it will also be available in our Facebook group, which is the Vocal Jazz Academy Educator Support. We're trying to help teachers get ready for fall, make it through COVID, but keep these conversations going as well. So just one more time, I want to say thank you to everyone. It is good to see your faces, and you all take care.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.